Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 1 of my series, The Mexican-American War, the Texan Revolution. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. Since the Mexican-American War was officially about the admission of Texas to the United States, it is necessary to provide some background about Texas. While Spain claimed Texas, it only really controlled a few villages and small towns. The rest of the territory belonged to various tribes. There were the Caddos, the Wichitas, the Kickapoos, the Wacos, the Kanankawa, and even Lipan Apache, but the true power was the Comanche. A series of Franciscan missions had been built to convert the tribes into peaceful, tax-paying Christians, and the Spanish traded with the more peaceful tribes. The policy was good, the execution less so. Transportation of large quantities of trade goods to a very remote frontier was a challenge for the Spanish colonial government, and the inability to maintain regular trade led to a return to raiding, especially after the United States bought Louisiana and started to compete for influence in the region through trade and gifts. Some Americans decided on their own to employ a more forceful approach, launching filibuster expeditions. Just a quick explanation. Filibuster means an unofficial military expedition into another country to start a revolution. During the Mexican Revolution against Spain, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and Augustus McGee led hundreds of men to seize part of Texas in 1812. But they were crushed by a Spanish army commanded by General Joaquin de Arredondo y Minio. Aside from killing rebels and filibusters, Arredondo executed so many Tejanos as a warning against further revolts that hundreds fled to Louisiana. Between the refugees and the dead, the population of Texas shrank dramatically, which destroyed the local economy. Since there was no chance of trade, the tribe simply raided the remaining settlements. One would think that Arredondo's mass executions would have convinced men seeking adventure to choose other options, but you would be wrong. Survivors of the Gutierrez-McGee expedition launched another attempt in 1816, but the expedition was a mix of Americans, former smugglers, Mexicans, and French, with oversized egos and conflicting goals, so the leaders plotted against each other, leaving them vulnerable to the Spanish troops, and they were crushed. Around the same time, the southwest of the United States was transforming into cotton country, driven by the need to satisfy the growing demand of the cotton industry in Britain. Once people realized that the Gulf Coast region of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana had the right soil and long growing season for cotton, hundreds of thousands of Americans migrated south. Cotton gins had made the production of cotton far less labor intensive, so cotton plantations spread across the region. By 1810, half of Britain's cotton supply was produced in the southern states. The growing populations of these new states desperately needed horses, which the Comanche obtained by raiding Spanish settlements and then traded to Americans at Nacogdoches. Rather than protect them, Arredondo ordered Tejanos to abandon their homes. Once the herds in Texas had been taken, the Comanche started crossing the Rio Grande to raid Nuevo León and Coahuila. Actually, the lack of royalist control over the region proved ideal for smugglers. The international slave trade had been banned in the United States in 1808, so the smuggling industry exploded under the leadership of the Lafitte brothers in 1817, and they sold thousands of slaves at bazaars held on the Texas side of the border. Given the lack of Spanish control over the region, it seemed inevitable that the United States would annex Texas in the near future, until the United States abandoned its claims to Texas in the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. While the treaty removed a potential problem for the government in Washington, it infuriated people in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Tapping into this anger, Dr. James Long recruited 200 men and invaded Texas in June, but his new republic lasted roughly 4 months until a Spanish force drove Long and his followers to flee back to New Orleans. However, the renewed attention to the Texas region revealed a sizable number of American squatters growing cotton in Texas. It also became clear that the region could not feed the troops sent to drive off Long, so hundreds of Spanish soldiers deserted rather than starve. While the Mexican government could stop anyone else from developing Texas, it was incapable of developing the region itself, so Texas seemed doomed to become a base for increasingly aggressive raids by the Comanche. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, an American entrepreneur named Moses Austin proposed to establish a colony of 300 settlers. Governor Martinez and his superior, General Arredondo, knew that Austin's plan risked greater connection to an expansionist United States, but they were desperate by this time due to endless Comanche raids, so they agreed. In addition, the government sent pardons to the Tejanos who had fled to Louisiana. Moses died soon after, but his son Stephen founded his colony in 1823. The offer of free land was attractive. A recent financial panic caused by land speculation had moved Congress to pass a bill that required buyers to pay for land in cash rather than finance most of it on credit. The bill succeeded, and land sales crashed by nearly 80% within a year. Public land in the United States was sold for $1.25 an acre, but all of the good land had already been claimed and sold for $50 an acre. Still, there were considerable risks. Aside from the danger of Comanche raids, most potential immigrants were worried that they would lose their slaves if they entered Mexico. Actually, slavery was legal in Mexico until the rebels won independence from Spain in 1821 and outlawed slavery. The drive to eliminate slavery was motivated by the rebels' deep desire to end all forms of social inequality. While this was a laudable decision, it was not a huge economic sacrifice, since slavery was nearly non-existent in Mexico. Instead, all of the hard work was performed by peons, basically indentured servants. However, many Tejanos had returned from exile in Louisiana, where they had seen firsthand the wealth that followed cotton plantations, and they were willing to accept slavery to bring that wealth to Texas. Moreover, the majority of immigrants came from the slaveholding region of the United States. Admittedly, only a minority actually owned slaves, but everyone wanted to because slaves were viewed as the key to wealth. Aside from helping during the planting and harvesting of cotton, slaves could be leased to farmers during the periods when they were not needed for the cotton crop. Slavery seemed unlikely to be accepted until the Americans found a way around the law. Recognizing that slavery would never be accepted under the term slavery, the colonists won legal agreement that foreign labor contracts would be honored in Mexico, and Austin then drafted a template contract that ensured that a field hand would need 60 years of labor to earn his freedom. Since food, clothing, and housing were deducted from his wages, it was impossible. Despite the region's potential, the cotton industry developed slowly. Transportation networks were rough, so colonists simply floated the bales of cotton, which weighed hundreds of pounds, downstream on rafts to the coast. Ships would transport immigrants from New Orleans to the Texas coast and take cotton bales back. Still, the colony grew and cotton exports had doubled by the end of the decade. As a result, while the colonists were governed from Saltillo, Coahuila, they were increasingly connected to New Orleans, the hub of the international cotton industry. Texas soon filled up with men who had failed back home. In the United States, clerks would simply write GTT, short for Gone to Texas, to close out unpaid accounts. By 1830, the number of Tejanos was 4,000, but the number of American colonists was approaching 30,000. Worried that unrestrained American immigration would transform a Mexican state into an American colony, the Mexican government passed a bill on April 6, 1830 that banned further American immigration. However, the law did not stop thousands of illegal American immigrants from crossing the Sabine River. It is important to point out that while many colonists came to farm or to grow cotton, others came to speculate in land. Therefore, this law directly impacted the speculators' plans because they had expected that they would be followed by more settlers, thus ensuring that their lands would greatly increase in value when the area became civilized. Instead, Texas would remain a frontier. If the cotton industry had declined, it would have reduced the American thirst for land, but global cotton prices rose steadily each year after 1831, so even more people wanted cheap land to grow cotton. Given the numerous attempts to conquer Texas, it should not be a surprise that many former filibusters had settled there, but they had not abandoned their goal of liberating Texas from the rest of Mexico. However, they needed an issue to rally support, and the April 6 law proved ideal, especially since it forced the colonists to pay customs tariffs. Many colonists refused to pay these fees and resorted to smuggling. Honestly, the colonists' growing dissatisfaction with their status as Mexican citizens and the steady stream of immigrants from the United States meant that rebellion was inevitable. The only reason why rebellion had not broken out was that it takes two to have a fight, and the Mexican government had been unable to do its fair share since the nation had only recently emerged from its own bloody revolution that had claimed 1/6 of the population. The colonists' desire to revolt was driven by a complex series of issues, including an inclination to avoid taxes, the need for slavery to grow cotton, the increased economic connection to the southern United States, and the refusal to become Catholic or give up trial by jury. Basically, the majority of the rebels came from the South and wanted Texas to become American, not they become Mexican. In fact, the Mexican government had reacted strongly because the United States' desire to annex Texas was not a secret. When Mexico won its freedom in 1821, the American ambassador's first announcement was an offer to buy Texas for $1 million. After Andrew Jackson became president, he raised the offer to $5 million, but it too was refused. Disappointed, Jackson confided to Colonel Butler, his negotiator, that in time, circumstances might compel us in self-defense to seize that country by force and establish a regular government there over it. As I already mentioned, many new residents of Texas were fervent land speculators, and they were not always law-abiding. Texas was actually part of Coahuila State, and corruption and land speculation in the state has sunk to such lows that President Santa Anna sent a general to arrest the speculators and the governor. A number of speculators, including Jim Bowie, tried to stir up the colonists against the threat of martial law, but the established settlers ignored the speculators and continued going about their daily lives. While Jim Bowie is famous for his knife, he really should be known for his lengthy career in land fraud. Profits from buying slaves from the Lafitte's and smuggling them through the bayous of Louisiana were used for land speculation. Well, actually land fraud, which was surprisingly common for the time. An overachiever, Jim Bowie had falsified such a huge number of land claims in Louisiana that he had to flee to Texas, where he became involved in an attempt to acquire 500,000 acres in Coahuila. Tensions continued to rise since colonists would resist Mexican officials who caught them smuggling. In addition, numerous slaves had learned that slavery was actually illegal in Mexico and would flee to Mexican outposts seeking freedom. Inevitably, they would be followed by lawyers representing the planters who wanted the return of their contracted laborers, enslaved humans. As I said earlier, numerous filibusters had settled in Texas, and heavy drinking was common at the time, so these lawyers were occasionally accompanied by armed, inebriated men, which led to confrontations with Mexican troops. When the colonists finally revolted in October 1835, the small, isolated Mexican garrisons fell quickly. Only the Alamo, a fortified mission at San Antonio de Bexar, held out for a month, but the garrison finally surrendered because they were running out of food. So, the Texans were free. Well, they needed to decide what kind of nation they would be, and they needed to prepare for the inevitable Mexican offensive. At least they had time, and recruits for the Texan army were arriving with every steamboat. lured by the desire for adventure and the promise of land. Overconfident, the Texan army quickly dissolved into several smaller groups. The greediest of the speculators marched off to take Matamoros, even though it was not part of Texas. However, the Mexican army arrived months earlier than expected. While Santa Anna's soldiers froze as they marched across harsh terrain during the winter, his cavalry picked up the men marching to Matamoros. The commanders of the Alamo ignored orders to abandon the fort and fought bravely, but the entire garrison was killed, including Jim Bowie and famous bear hunter and former Congressman David Crockett. Goliad could have held out, but its commander displayed mind-boggling indecision and incompetence, so the garrison was captured out in the open and then executed with other groups of Texan soldiers. News that Santa Anna was not taking prisoners forced General Sam Houston to retreat with what was left of his army, followed by much of the population as people abandoned their homes in what became known as the Runaway Scrape. The outlook for the newly independent Texans was bleak, but Santa Anna believed that the revolution had been crushed and was jealous that his subordinate General Jose Urrea was receiving most of the glory. So he pressed forward with a small force, hoping to win the decisive victory on his own. Instead, he was taken by surprise at San Jacinto, his army was slaughtered, and he was captured. After careful consideration, Santa Anna decided that Texas would be free, and he was allowed to live. So, the Texan rebels had achieved their goal. Except, their goal had been annexation by the United States, and the application process for annexation proved surprisingly complicated. While the annexation of Texas seemed an obvious move following the victory at San Jacinto, it became part of the growing debate between abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates in Congress. In the end, President Andrew Jackson was able to recognize Texas as a nation, but his term finished soon after, so he simply did not have the time to force annexation through the Senate. In theory, annexation could have been executed by Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, but he lacked Jackson's appetite for struggle. The Panic of 1837 caused such economic instability that Van Buren refused to use up his little political capital on a divisive struggle that would drive away his northern supporters. Since the application to enter the Union had been denied, Texas would have to navigate an uncertain future as an independent republic. To sum up, Mexico had struggled to control Texas due to raids by the powerful Comanche and filibuster expeditions by American adventurers, so it had allowed Stephen Austin to establish a colony in 1823. Thousands of Americans immigrated to Texas, attracted by free land perfect for growing cotton, until the Mexican government banned American immigration. Tensions escalated until the colonists revolted and quickly captured the isolated Mexican garrisons. However, President Santa Anna arrived with an army much sooner than expected and slaughtered the garrisons of the Alamo and Goliad. The revolt appeared doomed, but Santa Anna rashly pressed forward without his main army and was captured at San Jacinto, where he agreed to free Texas. I will discuss the Republic of Texas next episode. Thanks for listening.